The train had long since gone, its whistle fading into the wide Dakota sky, leaving only the echo of iron wheels and the drifting smoke that curled above the tracks. Emma Hayes stood alone on the platform with her carpetbag at her feet, her gloved hands clenched tight around the handle. The air was sharp with autumn chill, each breath rising in pale mist. Families had already met their loved ones, merchants had led their wagons toward town, and the platform that moments ago had been full of laughter was now nearly empty. No one had come for her. She adjusted the brim of her bonnet, though she knew it did little to hide what most people stared at first. The left side of her face bore the scars of fire, pale and ridged against skin that had once been smooth. She had learned to hold her chin high, but the whispers came all the same. A pair of young men leaning against a fence post chuckled as their eyes settled on her. One muttered something about ghost brides, another laughed louder than the wind. Emma felt the heat rise in her chest, sharper than the cold around her, but she would not let them see her flinch. She lowered herself onto a wooden bench, worn rough by years of weather, the boards pressing hard against her back. With stiff fingers, she drew out the letter from her coat. The paper creased soft from too many readings. She unfolded it slowly, though she already knew each line by heart. John Barrett, rancher of Dakota Territory, had written of needing a woman of steady spirit, someone who could bring warmth to a quiet home and help raise his son. His words had seemed honest, not flowery, like the false promises she had known before. She had believed him enough to buy the ticket west, enough to step onto this platform with hope tucked deep beneath her ribs. Yet the minutes stretched into an hour, and still he had not come. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her shoulders square. Around her, the last of the passengers drifted away, leaving only the echo of boots on boards and the sigh of wind through dry grass. She thought of the towns she had left behind, the doors shut in her face, the men who turned their backs when they saw her scars. The fire had taken more than skin. It had stolen the chance of being wanted. Yet she had dared once more, and now the ache of disappointment was almost too much to bear. It was then she noticed the boy. Small, no more than 6 or 7, standing near the hitching post with wide eyes fixed on her. His hand clung to the rough fingers of a tall man beside him. The boy tugged his father's sleeve and whispered, his voice carrying in the still air, asking if the lady was the one. The man's jaw tightened, his hat pulled low over his brow, his gray eyes unreadable. For a moment he did not move. Then he stepped forward, boots steady against the wood. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow long in the late Sunday. Emma's breath caught as he tipped his hat. "Are you Miss Hayes?" he asked. She nodded once, too quickly. He gave a slow nod in return. "I am John Barrett." His voice was deep, even, carrying a weight that made her chest ache. He glanced down at the boy, then back at her. "We had better head home before the light goes." There was no smile, no greeting, only the steady truth of a man who kept his word, even if he gave nothing more. Emma lifted her bag, her heart heavy and hopeful all at once, and followed him into the fading day. The wagon jolted over ruts in the dirt road as the prairie opened wide around them, endless fields touched with the fading light of autumn. Emma sat stiff on the bench beside John Barrett, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her carpetbag tucked by her feet. She could feel the boy's eyes on her, sharp and unblinking. But when she glanced down, he looked quickly away, clutching a wooden horse as if it were the most important thing he owned. The silence pressed heavy between them, broken only by the creak of wheels and the snort of the team pulling them home. John kept his gaze fixed ahead, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. He did not speak, and Emma wondered if he regretted sending the letters at all. His shoulders were broad beneath his worn coat, his hands calloused where they gripped the reins, his jaw tight as though words cost too much to spend. She thought of the lines he had written, simple and steady, not promises of love but of shelter, of a place by the hearth, of a boy who needed someone to care for him. Perhaps he had meant them only in duty, not in hope. The land rolled into shallow hills, the grasses turned gold by frost, the sky a wide sweep of pale fire. Emma found herself shivering, though the air was still. At last, the wagon turned into a narrow path lined by fence posts leaning with age. Ahead stood a house of rough timber, the roof patched with tin, the porch board sagging but solid. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, thin against the dimming sky. It was not grand, yet it carried the look of a place built by hard hands and harder years. When the wagon stopped, John climbed down first. He turned and offered a hand, but Emma hesitated before stepping down on her own. Her boots met the dirt, and she straightened quickly, clutching the carpetbag as though it might shield her from the weight of his stare. He studied her for a long moment before speaking, his voice low. "You will have your own room," he said. "You are free to leave when you wish, but while you are here, you will have a roof and food." Emma's throat tightened at the bluntness, yet she nodded. "Thank you," she murmured. He carried her bag inside without another word, and she followed. The cabin was plain, one large room with a hearth that flickered low, a table scarred with years of use, shelves holding jars of beans and flour. Against the far wall was a small bed neatly made, the boy's toys scattered close by. The child hovered near the doorway, his wide eyes fixed on her, his voice silent. John set the bag down in the corner. "Supper will be ready soon," he said, his tone steady but distant. "You will not be asked for more than you can give." His words cut both sharp and kind, and Emma felt a swell of something she had not expected, a fragile relief. She looked at the boy who still watched her with quiet need, and for the first time since she stepped off the train, she wondered if, perhaps, she had not been completely forgotten by God. The next morning, the frost lay heavy on the ground, glittering across the fields like a thin sheet of glass. Emma wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders as she stepped down from the porch, following John and the boy into town. The wagon rattled along the rutted road, the sound of hooves echoing through the crisp air. She kept her eyes low, bracing herself for the stares she knew would come. Each mile carried her closer to the place where her face would no longer be something hidden in letters, but displayed for every tongue to cut apart. When they arrived, the town was already busy. Men gathered near the smithy, their voices carrying rough jokes, while women with baskets of apples and jars of preserves crossed the square toward the church. Emma climbed down from the wagon, her gloved hand steady on the rail. She felt the weight of eyes fall on her at once. Whispers rose, faint at first, then clearer as she moved across the boards. "There she is," someone muttered. "The one who thinks scars can be covered by a bonnet." Another voice snickered. "Poor rancher, desperate enough to write for a bride who frightens children." Emma's steps slowed, but she forced herself to walk on. Her chin held high, though her cheeks burned beneath the cold. John paid little heed, though she saw the tightness in his jaw as he carried a sack of flour toward the store. Caleb stayed close to her skirts, his small hand brushing her sleeve, as if to tell her he would not let go. The boy's presence gave her courage. She drew in a slow breath, straightened her back, and lifted her gaze to the street ahead. Still, the voices followed. Women averted their eyes quickly, tugging their daughters away, while a group of young men leaned against a rail, their laughter sharp as knives. Inside the store, the warmth from the stove did little to ease the sting of it all. Emma kept to herself, folding her hands while John gathered what he needed. Caleb stood beside her, clutching the wooden horse he carried everywhere. A girl about his age pointed from across the aisle, whispering to her mother. The woman's lips thinned, and she turned her child away. Emma swallowed hard, wishing for the first time that she had never stepped off that train. But then Caleb shifted closer. He pressed against her side and looked up at her, his gray eyes steady. For the first time since she met him, he spoke. It was quiet, almost hidden beneath the clatter of jars and boots, but it reached her all the same. "Don't mind them," he whispered. "You are not scary." Emma's breath caught, her throat thick with the sudden sting of tears. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, unable to find words, only nodding once. When they left the store, the sky was already dimming, the air colder than before. The whispers trailed behind them, but Emma heard them less sharply now. Caleb's small hand slipped into hers, warm and certain, and for the first time in many years she did not feel completely alone. The ride back from town was quiet. The only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hooves striking frozen earth. Emma sat with her hands folded tight in her lap, the bag of flour at her feet, and the boy pressed close against her side. She felt the heat of his small shoulder through her shawl. His silence different from the silence of the man who held the reins. John Barrett kept his eyes forward, his jaw hard, saying nothing about the whispers that had followed them through town. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy with the promise of snow, and the wind cut sharp through the valley. When they reached the house, Emma stepped down first, her boots crunching on the frosted ground. She looked up at the cabin as if seeing it fresh. The rough-hewn timbers, the slant of the roof patched with tin, the smoke rising thin from the chimney. It was a place built for survival, not comfort, yet something in its sturdiness steadied her. She gathered her skirts and followed the boy inside. The cabin was warmer than she expected, the fire throwing shadows across the plank walls. The table still held the bowls from breakfast, the spoons neatly stacked, a jar of honey pushed to the side. Emma moved carefully, as though stepping into a room that did not yet belong to her. She hung her shawl on a peg near the door and placed her gloves in the pocket, her fingers brushing against the scarred skin of her cheek. Caleb, still holding his wooden horse, slipped past her and sat by the hearth, rocking gently on his heels, as though the flames held secrets only he could hear. Emma's eyes wandered to a door at the back of the cabin, slightly ajar. Something about it drew her closer. She pushed gently until it opened, revealing a small room, still and untouched. A narrow bed covered in a quilt rested against the wall, a wash basin on a stand, a mirror leaning crooked in the corner. Dust had gathered across the surface, but the air smelled faintly of lavender, as though the memory of the woman who had once slept there lingered. Emma stood in the doorway, her throat tight. She did not need to ask whose room it had been. John's voice carried behind her, low and firm. "That room stays as its island." Emma turned quickly, guilt pressing at her chest, but he did not scold, only closed the door gently and set the sack of flour on the table. She nodded once, her eyes lowered, understanding without words that some grief never left. That night they ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the scrape of spoons against bowls. When Emma rose to wash the dishes, Caleb followed her, placing his small hands on the rim of the basin as though to help. She smiled faintly, her scar tugging at the corner of her mouth, and let him hand her the spoons one by one. Later, when the fire had burned low, she lay in the bed John had given her, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere down the hall she heard soft footsteps, then the creak of a door. Caleb stood in the shadows, his eyes wide, his wooden horse clutched to his chest. He said nothing, only climbed onto the edge of her bed and curled beside her, his breath trembling. Emma held still, afraid to move, then slowly let her hand rest on his back. He pressed closer, and for the first time in years she felt the quiet of a house ease its grip. The walls were still empty, but they did not feel so hollow with the weight of a child's trust against her side. The wind had softened by morning, but the air was sharp with the bite of early winter. Emma stood at the well drawing water, her hands aching from the rope and the cold, while John stacked wood by the porch. The boy trailed after his father, dragging a small sled behind him, the wooden horse tucked into his coat, as though it, too, needed a place against the cold. It was a quiet rhythm they lived, each of them moving through the days without many words. Yet silence could not cover everything, not the shadows that lingered behind their eyes, nor the pasts they both carried like stones in their pockets. That evening the three of them sat by the fire, bowls of stew warming their hands. The boy dozed in his chair, his head tipping against Emma's arm, until she lifted him gently and laid him in his bed. When she returned, John was still at the table, his elbows resting on the wood, his gaze fixed on the flames. He looked up when she sat, his gray eyes steady, though something unspoken flickered behind them. Emma folded her hands in her lap, the scars along her fingers catching the light. She had not meant to speak, but the words slipped out like a confession. "I was meant to marry once," she said quietly. He gave no reply, only waited. She looked down, her voice rough. "A fire came to the house where I worked. I was caught inside. They pulled me out, but when my face healed, he would not look at me again. He told me he could not promise a future to a woman who would draw stares. She swallowed, her throat dry. That was the first time. The second man simply sent his brother to tell me he had changed his mind. The third left me waiting in a church. She paused, shame pressing heavy in her chest. That is why I came west. I thought letters might speak louder than my face. The silence stretched, and she wished she could pull the words back. But John only leaned forward, his voice low. I killed a man once. Emma's eyes widened, but he did not look at her. His gaze stayed on the fire. Cattle dispute. He came at me with a knife and I was faster. The law called it fair, but I carried it anyway. He rubbed his hands together, the lines of his knuckles deep. When Mary was alive, she told me I had to put down the gun if I wanted Caleb to grow with more than fear. I swore I would never raise him to think violence solved what words could not. Emma studied him, the weight of his confession, settling between them. She saw not pride in his voice, only regret, the same regret she carried in her own scars. Two lives shaped by wounds the world never let them forget. She reached for her cup, her fingers trembling, then spoke softly. We are both marked by things we did not choose. John met her eyes for the first time that night, and in the firelight she saw the faintest easing in his face, as if her words had lifted a fraction of the weight he bore. The first snow came early that year, drifting down in soft flakes that clung to the porch rails and frosted the split fence line. Emma stood at the window with her shawl pulled close, watching the fields turn white. The boy sat near the hearth with his wooden horse, dragging it back and forth across the floor with quiet focus. John was outside mending the chicken coop, his hammer striking in slow, measured blows. The house felt warmer than it had when she first arrived, though the walls still held more silence than laughter. At supper they ate in near quiet, the fire crackling while wind pressed against the shutters. Emma ladled stew into Caleb's bowl, smiling faintly when he looked at her with those steady gray eyes. He had spoken little since her arrival, but she had begun to notice the way his gaze followed her, how he leaned into her presence like a plant turning toward the Sunday. That night, as the table cleared and John carried wood to the fire, the boy set down his spoon and asked the question that made Emma freeze. Are you my mama now? The words were small, but they rang through the cabin like a bell. Emma's hand paused mid-air, the ladle dripping broth back into the pot. She lifted her eyes slowly, her heart pounding. Caleb looked at her with no shame, only a simple need for truth. John stiffened, his back straight as he set the wood on the hearth. His hands remained there, motionless, his shoulders rigid. Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to say yes, to wrap the boy in her arms and give him the answer he longed for, but the word caught in her throat. She was not ready, not certain she had the right. Her voice trembled as she said softly, I am someone who cares for you. Caleb blinked, then nodded once, though disappointment clouded his small face. He turned back to his wooden horse, dragging it across the table edge until it toppled to the floor. The silence that followed was heavy. John cleared his throat but said nothing. Emma gathered the bowls and washed them at the basin, her hands shaking in the cold water. When the boy went to bed, she lingered by the fire, staring at the flames as though they might tell her what to do. John stood across the room, his hat in his hand, his eyes shadowed. He finally spoke, his voice rough. He has not asked that since Mary died. Emma turned toward him, her chest aching. I did not want to lie, she whispered. John nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. He does not need lies, he said. He needs someone who stays. Later that night, Emma stirred awake, the blanket twisted around her. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she felt a small weight beside her. Caleb had crept into her bed, curling against her with his wooden horse clutched to his chest. In his sleep, he whispered again, Mama, as if the word had been waiting too long to escape. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She laid a hand gently on his back and let herself breathe the word in silence, not yet spoken by her lips, but alive in her heart. The morning broke cold and clear. The sky stretched wide in pale blue, the fields brittle with frost. Emma was hanging washed clothes on the line, her hands raw from the icy water, when she heard it first. Hoofbeats carried across the valley, steady and many. a sound that did not belong to a neighbor coming by for help or a trader passing through. Her stomach tightened. She turned, the wet sheet clutched in her hands, and saw them cresting the ridge, 4 riders moving in a line that cut sharp against the sky. John stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed as soon as he caught sight of them. He dropped the cloth, his boots crunching over the frozen ground as he came closer to the porch. Caleb, who had been playing with his wooden horse in the yard, froze in place, his wide eyes flicking from the riders to Emma. She bent quickly, pressing her hand to his shoulder. "Inside," she whispered, her voice steady, though her heart thudded hard. He obeyed, clutching the toy to his chest as he slipped through the door without a sound. The men drew their horses up at the gate, dust and cold air swirling around their mounts. At their head was Hank Laramie, a ranch hand known in town for a cruel tongue and a quicker fist. His grin spread wide as he tipped his hat toward John. "Morning, Barrett," he called, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. "Heard you went and brought yourself a wife by letter. Shame she looks like something out of a nightmare." Laughter rippled among the men, sharp and biting. Emma's face burned, but she kept her chin high. John did not flinch, did not look at her, only fixed his gaze on Hank. "You have no business here," he said evenly. Hank leaned forward in the saddle, his grin twisting. "Business enough when the land talks," he said. "Folks say you brought trouble under your roof, that a scarred woman brings bad luck. Maybe it's time you sent her packing." The words cut, but John stood like stone. "She stays," he said, his voice low, final. Hank's grin faltered, but he covered it with a laugh. "You always were a stubborn man, Barrett. Just remember, stubborn gets a man killed." His hand drifted to the pistol at his side, a slow threat that made Emma's breath catch. The air grew tight, the only sound the restless shift of horses. John's hand brushed the butt of his own gun. Not drawing, only steady, his eyes locked on Hank's. "If you want to test that," he said quietly, "you'd better be fast." The silence stretched long, brittle as glass. Then Hank spat into the dirt, tugged the reins, and turned his horse. "Not worth the bullet," he muttered. His men followed, though one glanced back with unease in his eyes. The hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the winter wind across the field. Emma let out the breath she had been holding, her knees weak. John turned to her at last, his eyes softening just slightly. "You're safe here," he said. She believed him, though fear still trembled in her chest. For the first time since she stepped off the train, she knew he meant every word. The sky had been gray since morning, low clouds dragging across the plains as if the world itself were holding its breath. By afternoon, the wind picked up, sharp and biting, rattling the shutters and whistling through the gaps in the boards. Emma stood at the window, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching the first flakes of snow tumble down. They looked harmless at first, soft and light, but the way they blew sideways told her the storm would not be gentle. John came in from the barn, stamping frost from his boots, his jaw set. "Storm's rolling in fast," he muttered. "We'll need to stay close tonight." Caleb was sitting on the rug by the fire, dragging his wooden horse through the ashes of imagination, but his small eyes lifted toward the door as if the wind itself called to him. The hours grew darker, the snow falling thicker, sweeping across the fields until the world outside the windows disappeared. The wind roared like a wild thing, shaking the house as though it meant to tear it from the earth. Emma ladled stew into bowls, her hands trembling more from unease than from the cold. She noticed Caleb's chair was empty. Her heart dropped. She searched the corners of the room, calling his name, but there was no answer. The door creaked on its hinges, a thin gust slipping in where it had not been shut tight. Emma froze. He was gone. John was already pulling on his coat, his face pale with dread. "Stay here," he barked. But Emma was at the door before he could stop her. The storm swallowed them as soon as they stepped outside, snow stinging their faces, the wind so fierce it stole their breath. "Tracks!" Emma shouted, pointing toward the fence line. Small footprints trailed through the white, nearly buried already, leading toward the hills. John cursed under his breath and charged ahead, his broad frame pushing through the storm. Emma followed, clutching her skirts, her boots sinking deep with each step. The footprints veered toward the old oak that stood alone at the edge of the ridge, its branches groaning under the weight of snow. Beneath it, huddled against the trunk, was Caleb. His little body shook, his arms wrapped tight around his horse, his face ghost pale in the storm's fury. Emma dropped to her knees, gathering him into her arms, pressing his frozen cheek against her chest. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking, "what are you doing out here?" His lips moved, barely a sound. "I wanted Mama." John's shadow loomed beside them, his arms pulling both of them close. His voice cracked as he muttered, "I've got you, son. I've got you." Together, they stumbled back toward the cabin, fighting each blast of wind, until at last the door slammed behind them, and the firelight wrapped around their frozen forms. Emma sat by the hearth, holding Caleb against her, as his shivers began to ease. His small hand clung to hers, as though it were the only anchor he had. John knelt across from her, his eyes meeting hers, raw and unguarded. "You saved him," he whispered. Emma shook her head, her tears falling freely. "No," she said softly. "He saved me." The storm howled outside, but inside the cabin, a fragile warmth took root, one that even the fiercest blizzard could not put out. The storm raged long into the night, the wind screaming through the cracks of the cabin and snow piling high against the door. But inside, the fire burned bright. Emma sat close to the hearth with Caleb pressed against her side, his small hand curled around her sleeve even in sleep. His breathing had steadied, no longer ragged with cold, though his lips still held a trace of blue. She stroked his hair softly, humming under her breath, until his lashes rested heavy and his wooden horse slipped from his fingers onto the rug. John sat across from them, his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes fixed on the flames. The light cut across his face, deepening the lines of sorrow that had etched themselves there over the years. He said nothing for a long while, and Emma thought perhaps he would rise and retreat into the silence he wore like armor. But instead his voice came low, rough, as though the words fought their way out. "I never thought I could need someone again," he murmured. Emma turned, startled. John did not look at her. His gaze stayed locked on the fire, his hands twisting together. "After Mary died, I swore my heart was buried with her. I told myself all I needed was this land and my boy. But tonight when I saw you holding him, when I thought I might lose him, and you too, something broke inside me." His breath caught, and he dragged a hand across his mouth, as if to steady himself. Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, yet fear tangled her words. Slowly she said, "I was not meant for love, not after the fire. I have lived too long with doors shut in my face, with men who saw only ruin where I once had worth." She turned her palm toward the fire, the scars shining in the glow. "When you offered me this place, I thought it was mercy, nothing more." Her voice wavered. "But tonight when Caleb reached for me, when he called me Mama in his sleep, I realized I wanted it more than I have wanted anything in years." John lifted his eyes at last, and she saw the weight of his grief and his longing all at once. "You are not ruin," he said firmly. "You are the reason my boy smiled tonight. You are the reason I still believe there might be more than survival." His voice dropped. "I do not know what I can offer, but if you stay, if you choose us, I will not let go." Tears burned hot in Emma's eyes. She leaned closer, her hand brushing against his as though pulled by something stronger than fear. The touch was small, but it carried more than any vow she had ever been given. The firelight wrapped them both, warming not only the room but the hollow places inside them. Outside the storm still howled, yet within the cabin, a fragile truth had been spoken, one that neither of them could take back. For the first time since stepping off the train, Emma believed she had not come all this way for nothing. The storm passed, leaving the land buried under drifts of white that glittered like broken glass beneath the pale Sunday. For days the cabin was wrapped in silence, broken only by the crack of wood splitting under John's axe, or the faint hum of Emma's voice as she stitched Caleb's torn mittens. Yet even in that quiet, news had traveled. By the time the roads cleared enough for wagons to reach town, the story of what happened during the blizzard had already grown into whispers on every porch. Folks spoke of the scarred mail-order bride who had gone into the storm after a boy who was not her own, and of how John Barrett had stood his ground when men came to drive her off. When John hitched the team and said they would go to town for supplies, Emma's stomach twisted. She pulled her shawl tighter, knowing what waited there. They rode in silence, Caleb wedged between them, his small hands clutching his wooden horse. The town came into view, the smoke of chimneys rising against the pale sky. As soon as they entered the square, heads turned, conversations hushed, eyes followed them from doorways and windows. Emma wanted to shrink, but Caleb leaned into her side, his quiet presence steadying her. John helped her down from the wagon, his touch firm, and together they crossed the boards toward the store. A group of men lingered near the smithy, the same men who had laughed weeks before. One of them muttered something, but it carried no laughter this time, only unease. Women paused in their steps, holding their baskets closer. Emma braced herself for mockery, but instead a single voice rose. It was old Mrs. Kearns, leaning on her cane at the steps of the church. "That woman saved a child," she called, her voice sharp. "Don't you dare speak against her." Murmurs rippled, not cruel this time, but curious. Another man, one of the farmers, stepped forward, nodding toward Emma. "My boy was with Caleb the week past. He told me she read to them both by the fire. Not many bother with that." A younger woman added, "She gave me herbs when my little one had fever. Wouldn't take a penny." One by one, voices rose, not in jeers but in defense. Emma's chest tightened, her hands trembling. For so long she had been the object of whispers, the shadow in the corner. Now she stood in the open, while people who once turned away spoke her name with respect. She lowered her eyes, unable to hold the weight of it. John stepped forward, his voice carrying firm and steady. "She is my wife," he said, his gray eyes sweeping the crowd. "She belongs here as much as any of you, and no man will tell her otherwise." A hush fell, followed by nods, then a murmur of agreement. No cheers, no applause, but something quieter and stronger acceptance. Emma felt tears sting her eyes as Caleb slipped his hand into hers. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, the town did not see her as a scarred woman or a mistake. They saw her as part of a family. And in that moment, beneath the cold winter sky, Emma felt chosen at last. Spring crept soft across the Dakota plains, the snow melting into rivulets that cut through the earth and left behind tender blades of green. The Barrett Ranch, once gray with silence, now carried the hum of daily life. Emma stood by the porch rail with her sleeves rolled up, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip, watching Caleb chase the hens across the yard. His wooden horse had been abandoned in the grass, forgotten in the joy of running. John was mending the fence line, his hat tipped low, his voice carrying now and then as he called instructions to the boy. It was not a grand life, not a life with riches or pearls, but it was steady, and it was hers. That afternoon, neighbors gathered in the meadow behind the cabin. There was no preacher, no church, only the wide blue sky and the cottonwood tree that stood tall and certain. Emma wore a dress she had sewn herself, plain brown trimmed with lace, her bonnet left behind so the wind could lift her hair. John met her beneath the branches, his broad shoulders taut with nerves, though his eyes softened when they found hers. Caleb stood between them, with wildflowers clutched in his small hands, grinning wide enough to split his face. The words spoken were simple, no vows rehearsed, no rings polished. John took her scarred hand in his rough one and said in a voice low and raw, "I choose you, Emma, today and every day." She swallowed hard, tears bright in her eyes as she answered, "I choose you, John, and I choose Caleb, for a family is not what we are given, but what we make." The boy tugged on their joined hands and shouted, "And I choose both of you," which made the neighbors laugh and cheer. Afterward they shared bread and stew, honey and cider, sitting on blankets spread across the grass. Laughter rose where silence once dwelled, and Emma felt her chest loosen as if a tight knot had finally come undone. She watched Caleb tumble in the field with the neighbor children, his voice rising high, his smile open and fearless. She watched John lean back against the tree, tipping his hat to block the sun, his expression peaceful, in a way she had never seen before. As dusk fell, the meadow glowed gold, and Emma found herself standing once more beside the porch, her hand resting gently on the rail. John came to her, his hand brushing hers, warm and certain. Caleb darted between them, clutching his flowers, shouting that supper was ready though nothing had changed since noon. Emma laughed, the sound bright and free, and for the first time she believed she was no longer the unwanted bride at a station, but the woman who had finally come home. If this story touched your heart, friend, take a moment to subscribe to Western Love Legends. Leave us a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this live on because of readers like you. And who knows, maybe next time the hens Caleb keeps chasing, we'll finally learn to run the other way.